Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Ruth Allen, I'm the Chief Executive of BASW, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. We are recording this webinar, just to let you know, but those of you in the audience can't be seen anyway, but just so you know, this will be recorded and shared after the event. I am joined this evening by Julia Ross, the Chair of BASW, and also by Roseanne Palmer, who is our Policy and Research Officer, who will be presenting on the findings of our survey. So we're here this evening to hear the results of our latest annual survey, a survey that we are now doing annually. So we're beginning to get some really good trend data about experiences of social workers in the UK, members and also some non-members, in their workplace. And also each year we alight on some particular topics for deep diving, and we'll be hearing about those this evening as well. This obviously coincides with just one day out from World Social Work Day, which was yesterday, which is when we're doing this recording. And we titled this event Buen Vivir, Buen Trabajo, to link in with the Buen Vivir theme of World Social Work Day this year, the global agenda theme as devised by the International Federation of Social Workers. I was just going to say a little bit about Buen Vivir and why we're talking about Buen Trabajo, which means good living, Buen Vivir, good work, Buen Trabajo, because it seemed kind of a relevant thing to link to some of the things that are coming out of the survey. So Buen Vivir is a Latin American term. It's become particularly influential in Latin America and has even influenced the constitutions of some nations there. And it is quite a radical and a departure from usual ways of thinking about what it means to have a good economy, a good society, good ways of living together. And it's drawing on indigenous knowledges and the experience of indigenous people and the need for protection for cultures, diverse cultures in Latin America, and the valuing of diverse cultures. And it's influencing social and economic policy and ideas about how people can live together more reciprocally, in better, greater focus on relationality between people, social cohesion, reciprocity between people, and to live in a less exploitative way, less exploitative of nature and less exploitative of people, which is where I think it comes in to relate to the idea of good work as well as good living environments, is how do we create work where people feel rewarded and appreciated, and where we're offering sustainable roles and sustainable jobs in social work, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and across society, and where we can perhaps create more compassionate environments for work, which is obviously in a way central to our notion of providing public and caring services, is how do we create cultures of compassion within organisations so that we can continue to provide services, provide support to those that we work with. So we're just making a little bit of a connection there between Buen Vivir, Buen Trabajo, and some of the things that people are telling us in our survey, as you are about to hear. But I'll leave that there. Just to say a few more little housekeeping things before we start. I said we are recording this, but if you're in the audience, you're not on screen, so it won't be recording you specifically. If you have questions, and we would really like some questions to come forward, we're going to have some panel discussion partway through the session after Roseanne's presentation. Please put them in chat rather than in Q&A. So if you can pop any thoughts or questions in chat, that would be great, and we will take them from there. So at that point, I am going to hand over to Roseanne, who will be talking to us for about 10 minutes about the present after some discussion on the other bits of the survey. But this is the main bit. So over to you, Roseanne.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully. Here we go. Okay, so we've split this into two parts effectively to reflect the two different elements of what Ruth was talking about there. And in the first half, I'm going to be really looking at what was said about work and working conditions. So this was the third annual survey that we've done now, which allows us to do a little bit of comparison across the years. A little bit of background. We opened the survey on the 7th of December last year, and we closed it on the 15th of January this year. We had 1,215 respondents from across the UK. As we always do with the annual survey, we asked respondents some background questions just to help us understand something about the workforce profile of the respondents. If you go to the full report, you can find that information in Appendix A, but just a few pointers. Almost 70% of respondents reported being employees. Almost 11% reported being either independent social workers or self-employed. 45% reported being experienced social workers, and another 24% were managers. Just over 7% reported that they were studying for a social work qualification, and that group will not have been asked every single question in the survey because, some of them weren't relevant. 45% of respondents said they worked mainly in children and families, with 35% working in adults and just under 18% working in mental health. Now, respondents were allowed to choose more than one option there, so when you look at that table, it won't add up to 100%. Over 2/3, nearly 68%, reported working for a local authority, and just under 7% worked in the NHS. Just over 4% of respondents had qualified outside of the UK. Now, as I've mentioned, we're going to split this presentation. I'm going to look at working conditions and experiences first. Respondents were asked about a range of issues. These included what had a positive impact in their current or most recent workplace, challenges in the workplace and facing the profession, workload and additional hours, experiences with bullying, harassment and or discrimination, and then the bottom two, sustainability in social work and supporting people to vote, I'll come on to in the second half of this webinar. We're not going to cover every single findings, but I'm just going to give you some of the top lines from these sections. So some questions we ask every year. This allows us to build up a data set over time and to identify trends and changes. And that's why you will see some questions being repeated annually. And these include questions asking people whether they agree or disagree with statements about being secure in their current role, whether they are happy in their current role, and whether they are happy within the social work profession. And as you can see here, almost 2/3 agreed or strongly agreed they felt secure in their current role. 55% said they were happy in their current job, and 60% said they were happy in the social work profession. And this is largely consistent with the findings that we had from last year. There's a suggestion of a slight negative shift in the findings on happiness in current job, but because we don't have identical sample sizes year on year, when there's small shifts, it's hard to disentangle what may have created them. We asked another repeated question about factors that have the most positive impact in the current or most recent workplace. We offer a list, and respondents are invited to choose their top three, if you like. They're not asked to rank those three, just to choose those three. And what we found is over the 3 years of the survey, these have remained unchanged. Peer support has always come out on top so far. However, we did note that it was chosen by a smaller proportion of the overall sample than last year. Appropriate level of management and supervision remains second most chosen option, but it was chosen by a greater percentage this year than last year, as you can see on that read across. Finally, effective multi-agency and or partnership working remains the third most chosen option with a very similar proportion. We asked a new question on whether people were seeing positive changes in the workplace around initiatives that have been discussed in recent years about how to improve workplace conditions and experiences, and whether these initiatives are being implemented and are having a positive effect in practice. And what we found, in slightly confusingly, it says none of the above because there aren't any options above that. However, it was the bottom option when the options were presented, and almost 2/5 of respondents said none of the changes listed. Just over 1/5 highlighted an improved flexible working policy. This may or may not have a relationship with changes to working practice as a result of the pandemic, because we know that part-time working, for example, can still be an issue. 17% also highlighted better team working and relationships or culture. And you can see also effective wellbeing support and better peer support, making up the top 5 most selected options. Biggest challenges in the workplace is a repeated question, and this has seen for 3 years now the same top 4 issues coming up repeatedly, although the order does change from year to year. This year saw an increase in the number of respondents who chose adequacy of staffing levels. You can see last year it was just over a third at just under 35%. This year it was almost 47% who chose that as an option. And that was then followed by access to resources for people respondents worked with, 46% this year compared with 30% last year. The next 2, workload demand and demands of administrative tasks, were the top 2 last year, but actually the proportion of people changing them changed very little. It was just that focus had shifted to staffing levels and resources. Moving on to my next slide, we also ask about biggest challenges to the profession. And again, we see a similar pattern with the top most selected options. The same options remain the most selected, but there is a slight shift in the ordering. This 2023 marked the first year that failure to adequately fund social care was not the most selected option. Cuts to local services was, and this may be a reflection of the impact of cuts to local services being increasingly widely felt as more and more councils are struggling with their budgets and their financial allocations. We asked another new question about what actions they most wanted to see BASW take to support improved working conditions. And I'm sure this is something that the panel will be looking to discuss. And the focus here, as you can see, was very much around campaigning and around raising and improving the profile of the profession. More than half selected more campaigning for higher pay and better working conditions. Nearly 48% called for actions to change public and media perceptions of social work, and almost 44% called for more direct work within social work employers to improve conditions for practice. Moving on to more repeated questions, where we're starting to build up this longitudinal data set, allowing us to look for trends over time. What we've seen with regard to workload is a fairly consistent picture. This year, just under 2/3 reported being unable to complete their work within their contracted hours, and slightly over half disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement that they felt able to manage their current workload. And if you look across for the findings for 2022, you can see that these are roughly comparable. Another new question for this year related to turnover of experienced social workers in the workplace. Concerns have been raised that more and more experienced social workers are leaving their workplace, and that was what triggered the inclusion of these questions. And what we saw was that almost 2/3 agreed that they had, in fact, seen an increased turnover of experienced social workers in their workplace, specifically in the last 12 months. And of those 2/3, more than 90% of those said that this turnover was having a negative impact upon the workplace and upon practice. Now, one of the things we said in the report is we're not actually sure where these experienced social workers are going. So that might be something we might look at going forward. My final core slide for this part of the presentation relates to bullying, harassment and discrimination. We have two questions that we have repeated annually. The first of these is around witnessing or experiencing bullying, harassment or discrimination, or being aware of someone who had. And what we see this year is just over 2/5 of respondents reporting that they'd either experienced one of or more of these things themselves in the last 12 months or were aware of someone that had. We then asked some supplementary questions of that subgroup. Last year, we asked questions around perceived motivations behind what happened, and also about the relationship between the people involved. This year, we focused in upon reporting of experiences and what happened. Now, of the group who said they had either experienced it or were aware of someone who had, 2/3 said that they had reported their experiences. And of the 2/5 who said they had witnessed or experienced it, 18% said concrete steps were taken to address the situation, and just 9.4% of that subgroup said that the actions provided them with a satisfactory outcome. We also asked some qualitative questions around those who wish to give us further information, and we'll be feeding that into a new piece of work. So, a very brief summary before I hand over to the panel. Peer support is important and valued in the social worker's experience. Over 3 years, the same issues repeatedly come up as key concerns and challenges. There remain considerable difficulties in managing workload within contracted hours. A significant minority are still experiencing or witnessing bullying, harassment, or discrimination in the workplace. And overall, it appears social workers have grave concerns about the sustainability of the profession. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my slides, hopefully, and hand over to the panel.
Roseanne, thank you so much. That was really interesting and really good to have that richness of experience coming through on our annual surveys, and I look forward to the next one. I personally thought this one was going to be a bit different, given that we're really post-COVID now, but it's intriguing and I think in some ways reassuring that it remains roughly the same. So thank you very much, Roseanne. I see that Omar has joined us. Brilliant, Omar. Good to see you. What I'm going to do now is to ask for responses from people, from Ruth, and then from Omar, and then I'll say a few words myself. That's okay. And then we'll open it up to you, the panel. And meanwhile, I hope that you're going to put questions in, as Ruth invited, into the webinar chat. But please do that because it helps us enormously. And we want to hear from you. So good. So I'm going to now ask for immediate response, just over a few minutes, I think. Ruth, from you, and then from Omar, say a few words myself. Thank you. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Roseanne. And in the chat now, you participants can actually open the report, although you might want to listen to this first and open it. I think what we're seeing with the repeated questions are trends which are really concerning and not surprising in terms of people's experiences. And actually, when I was first looking through the report before today, I was sort of feeling a sense of kind of this great kind of compassion for the situation that so many of our colleagues are reporting they're finding themselves in. I know that a survey like this is an opportunity to kind of lay it all out. And I think what we hope, because we're an independent organisation, we hope that we get some really honest responses in our survey. But it is, and that's good. And what's really evident is that there are some slightly, trends which we can come on to. but I was particularly struck by a few particular findings. One was the reduction in people choosing peer support as their kind of top sustaining thing in the workplace. And I think if one of the things that social workers are very good at is supporting each other, and we need to understand that a bit more. So one of the things we will be doing is digging into these quantitative figures, these gross figures and percentages, and we've got lots of qualitative data that sits under this that helps us understand it. So we will be doing that in further work with the data. But that as an example is concerning. But I think it's the sort of thing that can be turned around because social workers do know how to support each other. Support is important. I was struck that our new question on whether people had experienced loss of experienced social workers in the workplace, whether they had that experience, and if that had happened, whether that was detrimental to the workplace and to practice, and a strong report that it absolutely is. I think that's the one that's over 90%, isn't it, Roseanne? That where people were experiencing that loss of experience in the workplace.
Of those who reported
that
turnover, more than 90% of them said it was having a negative impact.
Yeah, which is what we'd expect. So in that, it fits with our understanding of what's going on in the workplace. But it's very concerning, and if we know that we've got we need more new people coming through. There are thousands of new social workers coming into workplaces across the UK every year from courses, but they need the mentoring, the supervision, and the kind of role model of people who are later in their careers. And we need to really preserve that. And I think we need to think collectively about that. There's lots more to say, but I think I'll just finish with the calls on BASW, what people want from us. This is quite a stable set of asks, actually, that people want us to work on their working conditions. I think we asked them a question about, do you want us to work more closely with employers? And there was a very strong response on that. So more direct work with employers is something that I'll say a little bit more about that later on in the session. Media and public perceptions and more visible campaigning. I think that social workers so often feel not seen and not heard for the difficulties they're having. Other public professions have very similar problems, but they see themselves more frequently in the media or in drama or in fiction as well as being reported. And they often feel they see a greater perhaps fairness in some of that reporting that you see for social work. So that's another big area for us, which we are doing things about with our journalism campaign and some other things. So absolutely key messages for us in BASW about what we do next.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Omar, good to have you with us. As I said, it's been very good working with you as the joint co-chair on council for the last year for experts. So thank you very much for that. Would you like to give your responses, please?
I think I want to. Oh, you can hear me now. Is that okay? Yeah, perfect. So I just want to build on, I think, what Ruth was saying around peer support. And I think it was really something stark and really clear from the survey is just, how important peer support is. And I think there's two interesting elements there. I think the first element is, it reminds me of the International Federation of Social Workers New Social Workers project, thinking about the lived experiences of young and new social workers. Actually, one of the key findings from that project was peer support, that kind of working together, discussing, situations, discussing feelings about what's happening in practice is so important. And I also kind of want to link that to Buonvivir, thinking about Buonvivir being about relating to each other, thinking about being in harmony with each other, thinking about the importance of human connection and people being able to support each other for a kind of harmonious society. I think there's a real key link there. Is that potentially people are asking for Buonvivir, for that kind of indigenous philosophy of more harmony, more peace, and more support as each other as humans. So I think that's a really kind of important link there into the World Social Work Day theme. I think the only things that I would add, from looking at the survey, from obviously listening to the presentation, I think there's something really stark around the sustainability of social work as a profession. And of course, the BASW conference will talk a lot about sustainability. And I know some of the experts by experience will be presenting on sustainability around kind of built environments. One of the things that I've been thinking about when we think about the environment that we live in, and kind of what Bruin Verveer would have to say about that. So Bruin Verveer, would very much want us to think about how, again, thinking about harmony, how us as humans, do we live in harmony with our nature, our environment, the kind of the spaces and the environments that we find ourselves in and around. And what does that kind of relationship look like, and all those sorts of things. And I think I wonder, the fact that the cost of living crisis really came out as a kind of major factor into something that's actually harming, people's experiences of environments. I wonder when we think about Bruin Verveer, we think about this hope for harmony. If we've got situations where people are living in, poor housing conditions, in poverty, they've got dampness, kind of mold growing. I think I've been stuck with this kind of picture in my head that actually the environment is killing people. Mold, dampness, that can have a real negative health impact on people. And I think that makes me feel actually, are we achieving Bruin Verveer? Are we heading that way? As a society, when we've got kind of really strong levels of poverty, that actually means the environments aren't in harmony with our people, within UK society. Unfortunately, poverty is a global issue. And I know BASW are doing a lot of great work on kind of anti-poverty strategies. So I think that's another link into something I know BASW will kind of continue to campaign on. But yeah, that's everything from me for now.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Omar. Just a few comments from me, and then we'll move on to you and the questions you. We've got 2 questions in the panel so far. There must be more, but they're very good ones, so we can start with those. What I'd like to say, my immediate response was, I guess on top of what's already been said, and very nicely said, about the themes that we're talking about now and sustainability, is that it struck me that one of the quotes that Rizan gave us was, on visibility. We don't have a public image. And maybe that's right. Maybe we don't have one. Maybe it's not that we have a negative one, which I think a lot of us tend to believe, but that we don't have one. And so a lot of drive, I think, from the responses on actions to change media perceptions, but the public, but also to make us much more visible. Now, there are risks in doing that. We know that there are, but there are risks in not doing it too. So I'm going to take that away and with Ruth and others have a really long think about how we can make ourselves more visible, because everything that we do is in the public interest, and somehow that's not always grasped. And we know some of the reasons why, but I don't think we really fully understand. So, Roseanne, I'd like to understand a bit more about why people are saying that, and talk with others about it. So, enough from me and enough from us. Over to you. We've got 2 questions. Oh, we've got 3 questions now. Why do we think the public has a negative view of social work, and what can we do about that? And then I'm going to move on to a good question from Johnny, which talks about the data variation. Roseanne, that's for you in different parts of the country. But I'd be interested in the 4 nations, because we're unusual as a profession in having a very strong 4-nation approach, and that's incredibly valuable. So a bit more from you, Roseanne, on that, and then we'll move on to Ruth Buchanan's. So why do you think, Ruth and Omar and Rizan, that the public has a negative view of social work, and what could we do about it? Ruth, do you want to come in first?
Should I just? It's interesting because I think there is research evidence to show that social workers think the public image of us is worse than it actually is. So when there have been studies done in different parts of the UK, in fact, public understanding or public kind of appreciation or valuing of social work is not as negative as people think. I think it's very split, really, between perceptions of children's social work and child protection specifically. There's a very long history to that in the UK context, and other bits of social work, which are probably much more under the radar, but don't get the negative press and don't get the negative public perception. So there's, and I would say that there is something specific about the history of social work in the UK, and that the predominance of social work being associated with child protection, which you don't see in every other nation. In other nations, the role of social workers with older people, mental health, disabilities, is not as hidden, if you like, by, or is not as obscured by something of a preoccupation with the social work's role in child protection. And so I think there's something about changing the image of child protection in particular, or not just child protection, social work with children, because obviously it's not just child protection. There's lots of things that social workers do to support families. And something about raising up the awareness of all of the amazing roles that social workers do. And BASW does try to profile that. I mean, we're one of the few organisations that can really showcase the diversity of social work, not just in statutory social work either. But there's much more to be done on that. But I do think we have to maybe look at what's happened in some other countries where they've been able to have a more balance. They've got the role of the social workers more into the public consciousness.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Omar, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I would say is I strongly believe that social workers can do an amazing job, and I think that absolutely should be celebrated. I've just had a long day in practice, and I'm very proud of the job that I do, and I think social workers should be proud of themselves. Absolutely. In saying that, I do think I guess like the responsibility or the onus or maybe even the power is the right word when we think about power dynamics of who decides who is a good social worker and whether social work is a good profession or not should kind of be held by those that are experiencing social work. So I think when we improve the experiences of people experiencing social work, I'd really like people with lived experience, experts by experience, to be able to talk more positively about their social work experiences. I'd like to hear more from them in terms of, what made, what made kind of their care plan so good, or what was good social work practice like to them. So I think that there's a lot of power, I think, that needs to be shifted into how people are experiencing social work and to celebrate that, but from their perspective. But at the same time, we should also celebrate, social workers, within themselves. I think the other, maybe last thing to say is, social workers aren't superheroes, and we shouldn't be expected to be superheroes. I think we need to be realistic about what social workers can and cannot do. I think we, take on the role of a superhero, many times, but unfortunately, we don't have superpowers. And I think to be expected to do a very, tough job, at times, but with no superpowers, can almost leave us feeling traumatized, and feeling very difficult in practice, which I think we see in the survey. So yeah, I think that kind of responsibility and I guess that onus and that power onto people with lived experience, but also to be realistic about what social workers are doing and can do and what's expected of them.
I think that's a really positive. It's a journey we're on, isn't it? And the more that we use and work with and understand experts, then the bigger we will become. I'm sure we've got superpowers, though. Anyway, Roseanne, any more comments on that? But also, you've got a couple of questions on the data. So, would you like to address those?
Sure. I'll just briefly pick up on the question of perceptions of social work, and I'm coming at it from the perspective of not being a social work practitioner. And rather than negative, I think there may also just be lack of understanding and awareness of what social workers do. I think far fewer people come into contact with social workers than come into contact with GPs, nurses, healthcare staff. It's not as universal a role in that respect in terms of the number of people coming into contact with social workers. And therefore, I think people just don't necessarily, as Ruth said, they don't have a full understanding of all of the many, many different roles that social workers fulfill. And so maybe it's less negative and perhaps more neutral in the sense that, you know, because of that potential lack of awareness or lack of understanding. I'll just deal with the two data questions. The first is we don't have the breakdown between nations currently. However, our surveys are inevitably dominated by respondents from England purely because of the demographic distribution across the UK. So this year, the data may well be being influenced by these high-profile declarations of Section 114, which is an effective declaration of a local authority's bankruptcy that we've been seeing in the last 12 months. And that inevitably has quite dramatic impacts on local services. We know, for example, that Birmingham has recently passed an absolutely scything budget in terms of what they're going to be able to continue to support. Obviously, they have to continue to support their statutory duties, but so many other things that might be used to support people or that might act in a preventive capacity have been disappearing from the local landscape. So my inclination is that, you know, my gut instinct is that may be largely England driven, but I can't prove it based on the data from this survey alone. In response to Ruth's question, this is really interesting. We didn't ask about this specifically this year, Ruth. We had a question in the first annual survey, the 2021 annual survey, that asked people about their plans for the next 3 years. And it was quite marked then how many people were thinking of taking early retirement or were thinking of leaving the profession. I think that probably came to around, I think it was possibly 15% each, but I'm relying on memory here, which is a little tricky. We didn't drill down into it this year, and it's why I made that passing comment about we don't actually know where these experienced social workers are going when they leave that workplace. So we don't know if they're going into another role, if maybe they're going independent, whether they may be taking early retirement, or that whether they may be going to work outside the sector. And I think one of the things we might want to look at going forward is whether we rerun the question from 2021 or whether we find another way of capturing information, because you're absolutely right. And that's why it's recruitment and retention. If we're not retaining people, then the number of student social workers being recruited is firstly not going to be able to fill that gap. And secondly, and I you know, some of the rest of the other panel's members may want to comment on this, it's also about that loss of experience within the workplace. So when you are newly qualified, a lot of, especially when you're office-based, a lot of what you learn is what you learn by observation and being around people who do have experience. Yeah. And so that's why that retention aspect also becomes so important. So in terms of the data, I can't give you more detail. If we go back to the 2021 survey, we did have a question on it. And I think, Ruth, what I would be saying is that this is definitely this is one of those questions that we ask to get an indication of what's going on. And then we look at how we can drill down and capture more information going forward.
That's absolutely fascinating. Do you know, I'd like to ask Ruth another question myself too. And it's to do with that. On the slide where you talked about visibility, social workers were saying, or the respondents were saying, that they wanted us to do more direct work with social work employers to improve conditions for practice. Well, social worker employers are largely local authority employers, but of course they are also third sector and independent. But I wonder whether we could, as you said, do things a bit differently and not through the survey, perhaps sound out employers with exit type interviews for why their workforce are leaving them, and do a survey jointly so that we can get a real picture of whether people are moving on to something different, or whether they're leaving altogether. Fascinating world. And I think it's important that we do talk to employers and I'd like to see us doing more of that. Exactly how it would be something else. Ruth, you had your hand up.
Yes, I was. Yes, it's about people leaving the profession. I think in terms of getting the data, I think many social adults and children's social work, social care departments, they know. I think they know quite, and I'm sure they have lots of data, and it would be really good to perhaps with our data then kind of see where with partners we can actually gain some other data about some of the broad information that's out there relating to people leaving, and where people are going. So let's see what we can get with partners, and then see if there's something we need to do with partners to get more information on that. I think the other issue around experienced people leaving also links to the post for me links to what I'm hearing about the post-COVID working environment, particularly in local authorities, where people are still working largely or considerably online, and working flexibly. So the flexible working result have gone up because that obviously gives people more choice. But that dealing with the isolation that can come if that includes a lot of working not in a team and not with colleagues. And I know that authorities are working in different ways with bringing people back into the office space and being physically with their colleagues. That's really important as well. And I think the kind of tradition in the culture, if you like, within the profession is of being, when things are working well, you're in a great team. It's a team. It's a people that you actually know in real life. You actually have contact with them, and if you're less experienced or you're after a particular piece of advice or information, you go to somebody more experienced, and there's that informal peer and group supervision context. Now, that doesn't always work. I mean, toxic teams are toxic teams. Teams can be good or bad or indifferent. But there is something in that, in a way, what Omar was saying about that human connection and relationship. So that the relations that you have with your colleagues is a kind of, the positivity of that is restorative and allows you to be then emotionally available and to create and to have relationships with people that you're working with. And so there is a sense that that loss of experience through people leaving perhaps a bit earlier than their career than they might have done, and not working so much in person together are two kind of factors I think we need to think about. I'm just going to just move on to a slightly different issue, Julia. I don't know whether we want to say something about the other start finding was around bullying and harassment and discrimination. We asked some sort of specific questions about that, didn't we, Roseanne, that were a bit more than we'd asked before about the nature and about follow-up. And we can see from that of those who had either experienced or witnessed it and had taken steps to report it, of that cohort, only 9% felt they got a satisfactory outcome. So, I mean, that needs a lot of unpacking. And as I said, I know there's quite a lot of qualitative data that sits behind all these statistics, but it is really concerning and worrying that I think it's something, was it like 40 or 50% of people had, 45% had actually seen bullying, harassment, or discrimination in the workplace. So that really needs to be properly understood.
I'm really glad you raised that, Ruth, because apparently we don't. I mean, it happens in other professions, of course it does too, but it happens in social work, and that's what we need to tackle. Calling it out doesn't always seem as easy as it should be, but perhaps we need to think a bit more about that. But I'm really glad you raised that. Thank you. I'm going to pass back to Roseanne now for you to give us, please, your final presentation. And then Ruth is going to chair the panel of questions, which will be fairly brief as we move towards our concluding remarks. Thank you. Over to you, Roseanne.
We can't hear you, Roseanne.
I'm just going to arrange to share my screen again, which is always more complicated than you think on Zoom. Here we go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. So within the annual survey, we ask repeated questions and new questions about working conditions and work experiences. We also have sections on what I think, or what I tend to call in my head, topical questions, which are questions that we introduced based on what's happening, or something we particularly want to investigate in the course of the current year. So this is going to be a much shorter interjection from me. We're going to look at 3 issues that affect people with whom social workers work and also affect social workers themselves. Now, in the 2022 survey, we had a larger section on the impact of the cost of living crisis, but we did repeat 2 of those questions again this year, just to help us keep track of some of that impact. And what we can see is that just over half of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that the number of people they were working with has increased as the cost of living has increased, and that almost 64% agreed or strongly agreed that they were now working with more people, specifically people living in poverty, than before the onset of the cost of living crisis. So actually, they're working with more people who are being affected, if you like, and being pushed into poverty by what has happened. So that's our first topical issue, if you like, and that's why I've linked it to the idea of buen vivir and good living. We had quite a substantial section, topical section this year, on the question of sustainability and social work. And that some of that relates to the sustainability of the profession, but we were also looking at broader ideas around sustainability. Now, this was quite an extensive section, unusually for one of our annual reports, and the majority of the findings are actually going to form the basis of a further report that will be linked into BASW's annual conference in June. But just to give you a taster of some of the findings, almost 2/3 reported that the people with whom they work are negatively impacted by issues related to the climate crisis and/or environmental degradation. 1/4 agreed that the people with whom they work had regular access to green initiatives, but significantly more reported that access to green initiatives had a positive impact on those people's lives. And that's something we can think about. 3/4 said that access to local green spaces has a positive impact on the people with whom they work, but only half reported those people actually being able to access local green space on a regular basis. And again, these are things that we need to think about in terms of how, and Omar touched on this briefly earlier, how the environment around us affects what we're doing. And one of the things that we do recognize is that accessibility means different things for different people. Or how things are accessible. The final topical section was around voting and promoting and supporting voting. And one of the reasons for introducing this section is that we have to have a UK general election before the end of January 2025. There have been changes to requirements for voter identification, but we also want to know about providing support with voting and how social workers do that and how they can be supported to do that. And what we found was 2/3 of recipients agreed that social workers did have a role to play in promoting and or supporting voting, and just under 1/5 reported having done so in previous elections. Now, inevitably, some of those who are newly qualified, so there hasn't been an election, or who perhaps work in quite specific fields in social work, may not have had the opportunity to do so. But this is something we do think about in terms of enabling people to and empowering people to exercise their rights as citizens, to exercise their rights in decisions that affect their lives. We also asked a question about changes in requirements for voter identification, and just over 10% reported that they or someone they worked with had been unable to vote in their most recent elections. The caveat on this is not all local elections will have been affected or will have been impacted yet by changes to voter ID requirements. However, looking to the UK general election, those new voter ID requirements will be implemented or will be enforced for the UK general election, even if in some of the nations in the UK, they might not be being implemented for devolved or local administration elections. Which is why we were keen to find out if people had been affected. I'm going to wrap up there. I will say that there is far more to discover in the published report, and I've dropped the link in the chat. But what I really want to say is thank you for listening, and especially thank you to every single person who gave up their time to fill in the survey. With that, I'm going to hand you back to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can find the button, and hand you back to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roseanne. So it's really interesting new topics that we covered there. Could I come to Julia, maybe, to give a bit of a response to those points that have been raised around sustainability, promote the vote, and cost of living, our sort of new deep dive areas.
So the what I'd like to pick up is the cost of living. It is so fundamental to the way we live, and I know that social work, like a lot of, and I often say like a lot of other professions, because I think sometimes we're out in the wild, and we don't need to be, because we're not actually. We're an integral part of social care and the way that lives work. So I'm particularly interested in the impact of poverty and the impact of global warming and global change and climate change on and fuel poverty, on the way, not fuel poverty, food poverty, the way that the war in Ukraine has really damaged some of the food supplies that we're having. And I think that's something quite fundamentally new and really significant for how we live our lives. So important for me. I'm not sure. Yes, I want to say one more thing, if that's okay. There's a brief amount of time, I know. But the general election coming up, and the importance of citizens being supported in their vote is crucial. So we've got a really good election manifesto, and we've also been working with SWU, that I'm very proud of, to make sure that we have a consensus and a way of working that social workers can use in and with their local communities. And I think that's really valuable and really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Omar, would you like to make some comments?
Absolutely. So I think there's a really interesting thing here when we talk about sustainability. It's really good that we are having focused energy, time, and space to talk about and talk through what sustainability means. And I think in a UK context, it's quite interesting. I think one of the things that stands out to me is, things like access to local green spaces. I think too often, social workers wouldn't think about that necessarily in practice, and how actually that local access to a green space may support and enhance or kind of have meaning to someone's well-being. And I think it's very much, from what I understand, obviously I've practiced as social work and adult social care, yeah, and I've kind of seen it from kind of both ends in terms of lived experience of adult social care too. And I think when I think about well-being, well-being is really individual, and it's really meaningful to whoever the person is that is being spoken to or spoken with. And I think well-being means something different to everyone. Buren Verveer would talk a bit about well-being in terms of kind of a global understanding of that kind of good way of living. What is that good way of living? What is that well-being? What does happiness mean to someone? All those sorts of things. And actually, Buren Verveer allows us or invites us to think about how someone's well-being links in with their their environment, their nature, all those sorts of things. So I think again, linking it back into Buren Verveer, I think it's time social workers start thinking about well-being in I guess a wider perspective, and just how important the sustainability of environments, of access to environments can be for people's well-being. And I don't think that's often put into adult social care assessments. And maybe it's time that we start to think about well-being from a wider kind of perspective, and bringing in that kind of Indigenous knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar. It reminds me of, I had the privilege yesterday to spend half the day on World Social Work Day with social workers in a borough in London. A very, very densely built up, I mean, extremely densely, full of new high-rise kind of spaces. And I was traveling there, looking around me as I arrived I couldn't see any green space. We had a really, really good discussion about Bouenville with other contributors as well. And it was actually really resonating with the challenges of serving a very large, to a large extent, very impoverished population, people living in very non-green spaces. And it was then related to how we look after ourselves. And there was a really nice well-being session. And it just felt like this, what might seem like a very far away concept, and drawing on distant kind of cultures and considerations and priorities, actually came right home into that room in London, and felt very connected with the challenges of self-care, of the challenges that people were facing around isolation, not being in community, and social workers' role in helping people be more in community, be more connected with nature, but also with other people. So it was really interesting to feel that come together. We are going to draw to a close, and I just wanted to make a few kind of final comments. I'm going to just note that there was a question in here about the increasing presence of digital and AI, and what difference do you think it will make? I can't remember whether we've got a question on digital in this year's survey. No, we haven't got any specific findings on that. It's a great question, so don't go away in terms of thinking about that and joining with us on activities and events and developments in relation to AI and digital, because I think the impact of that on our ability to practice relationally, and the impact of things like poor digital infrastructure versus good digital infrastructure. You know, poor digital infrastructure can be a great source of stress in the workplace. It can be inclusive for people we work with, or very exclusive. And another discussion we had yesterday was about the exclusivity of some ways in which local authorities and other organisations are going online for everything, but that's actually creating barriers for many people in communities. So I'm a great believer that we can do fantastic things with digital, but it's all about how it's done, whether it's accessible, whether it's suitable. And as a profession, we really need to kind of take some control in the discourse around what's happening with digital, and that's something that BASW was working on. And there's another question about what do you feel the future holds for the profession? I'm not going to try and give a pat, simple answer in the last few minutes of this webinar. I do think that the strength of social work is in our coming together in a strong peer identity, a strong professional identity, and being one profession and not being split apart into the different sub-parts of social work, but actually continuing to connect across all parts of social work. And that's a key role for BASW. I think that if we can really focus on valuing within ourselves the fantastic that we do, we're effective, we know where we need to improve, but it's the relationality, that relational ways of working that supports us as a profession, and that then supports people that we work with. So I think there's a lot to be proud of. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think we know a lot about the right ways to do things and better ways to do things. We need more resourcing. What does the future hold? I think, well, we do have an election coming up. I was just going to finish on this, and the conference. So we have a conference in June. Come to our conference on sustainability. It's in Edinburgh. It's going to be fantastic. You can also join it online. please do sign up. It's going to have a fantastic array of speakers for us to explore both environmental sustainability and professional sustainability. So to some extent, answering that question, what does the future hold for the profession? We also have for the election that will happen at some point in this calendar year, we have a manifesto which we are actually launching next week. So please look out for that. And that has a lot of very sort of tangible asks. It has the aspiration of what we want from a new government that will actually tackle the importance of getting behind and supporting and investing in public services for next generation. But it's also about specific changes that we know, because of our knowledge of our communities, we know these things can make a difference. So some very practical proposals for a new government. So, and then you can give us feedback on that as well. And finally, I would just say that we are launching a new strand of work around working conditions, which will involve closer working with employers and actually looking at how we can be much more visibly involved in solving some of these difficulties. BASW can't do it on our own, but this is about, we have to play a full part with all of you, our members and non-members and social workers everywhere, pulling together to try and turn around this situation and to keep campaigning and being visible for the things we know are right. So on that, I will draw this webinar to a close. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've had a good session with us, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you,
everyone.
Roseanne, and thank you, Ruth and Omar. Good to see you all. And thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.